This is Dan Schneider, and this is American Television with Mitchell Hadley. It's been a few months since we've talked about the decades. That's how we started out this program. So now we're back to end out the 20th century in the 1990s. But before we do, let me introduce you to Mitchell Hadley. To my, what would it be? I guess on the screen it's to my left. And Mitch, if you could just give a little summary of who you are and what you do.
Sure, I'm a classic TV historian. I've written about classic television for almost 15 years at the website itsabouttv.com. I'm also the author of 4 books, including The Electronic Mirror, which looks at TV's place in cultural history, and my newest book, Darkness in Prime Time, How Classic Era TV Foresaw Modern Society's Descent into Hell. That came out earlier this month, and that talks about classic TV and how it essentially prophesies the world that we live in today.
So, for anyone who watches any of these shows in the future, 1 through 30 or so that we've done, let's just keep things rolling because last month we did a couple of bio shows on Bill Cosby and Roseanne Barr, which were the two leading sitcoms of the late 1980s into the 90s. So why don't we start with situation comedies heading into 1990, other than those headed by the dark duo of Roseanne and Cosby?
Well, there were I think 5 major shows in the 90s that come to the top of the list when you look not only at the popularity of sitcoms in the 90s, but the role that they play in television going forward. You've got Seinfeld, which I suppose is the prototype of the 1990s sitcom, the idea of a show about nothing. And it really was a show about something. But one of the things that it did was, if not introduce, at least was a major example of a comedian who had taken the basic premise of his stand-up routine and transferred it over to television, not necessarily as a character, but the philosophy behind his stand-up act. Seinfeld was playing a stand-up comedian in the series. It was originally called the Seinfeld Chronicles when it started as a replacement series, and it introduced this idea of the central character, the group of characters around him. It's not a workplace-based sitcom, and it isn't always plot driven. What really drives the series is the relationship between all the characters. And the characters aren't necessarily the most pleasant either. In that sense, it is not unlike, I think, the Honeymooners, where you liked them, you sided with them, but you got to see Ralph Cramden's dark side as well as his good side, and they weren't the perfect couple. And I think you see some of that in Seinfeld as well. But I think that although I was never a big fan of it, but it was a culturally defining show of the 90s, and I think that it set itself up in such a way that all the sitcoms, not only in the decade but going forward, had that show in some sense as a basis of what they were going to do. The one that follows that is I think closely related to it in a way, and that's Friends, because it's another sitcom where what's important is this relationship between the characters. They're not bound by familial relationships, so you don't have a household as you traditionally would in a show, Leave It to Beaver or Father Knows Best. It's also not even a show where you have relationships through marriage, like All in the Family, where you have in-laws that are coming into it. These are friends that have connected and remain connected and seem to do nothing but connect. And if you wanted to be critical about it, and I think there's plenty of room for that, you could say that it is kind of a meditation on not growing up, about what you essentially have are relationships not unlike those between kids in high school or college, and they're trying to carry that through for the rest of their lives with varying degrees of success. I remember famously, one of the critical cultural commentators remarked about the show that what it really established more than anything else was the pointlessness of sex, because the sex was so free and easy in this show and so indiscriminate in so many ways that the message it really sent forward to people was that it wasn't important at all, because if it was important, it would be handled with more gravitas and more dignity than it was in the show. So for me, that's one of the key things that comes out of this: clearly defined characters, but also a very clear representation of what culture was becoming in the 1990s and how it would be reflected going forward from there. You've got a show like Home Improvement, which I think is a lot like Seinfeld, because again, in Tim Allen, you're seeing a character who is bringing his stand-up routine onto the big screen, and essentially playing the same character. That's different though. It's not the same as Seinfeld or Friends, because what you've got is a combination of a workplace comedy, the television show itself, and a domestic comedy, the relationship between Tim and his family. So those are two very traditional elements of sitcoms, and yet by introducing this alternative world, this show within a show, that show almost creates an aura of its own in a much different way than, the Alan Brady show on Dick Van Dyke, for example, which was seldom seen. Tool time is a regular part of Home Improvement, and it hones that persona that Tim Allen has, and he creates a cottage industry out of it. I think the other two sitcoms that really stand out are Fresh Prince of Bel Air. I won't go into that one as much, but I think what is very important about it, two things. One is that you have a completely different black subculture than you're used to seeing when you were talking about shows like The Jeffersons, or the appearances of black characters in predominantly white sitcoms. You've not only got in The Fresh Prince a black leading character, but you're also introducing a completely different cultural flow to the show than what viewers may have been accustomed to. It's very urban. It is very serious in many ways. I think that's the second thing about it that I would stress, that Fresh Prince introduced some darker aspects into sitcoms, not the traditional very important episode, but it dealt with real things that were going on in the world, and this strange dichotomy that occurs between the Fresh Prince finding himself in Bel Air and yet remaining true to his roots in a certain way. And you're coming up with some very interesting ways that the series plays that. I think the final one that I would point out is probably Frasier. And what stands out for me there is that it is one of the most literate of the sitcoms. It again is kind of a hybrid. It's a spin-off from Cheers, so you've got some of the same vibe in that the home away from home. The main character with a lot of friends and interactions with people who aren't part of his immediate family. However, certainly does have that family aspect in a very strong way as a foundation of the series. But it's also kind of like the Odd Couple. The dynamics between Fraser and Niles are remind me at least very much of that Odd Couple type thing. And then again, it's another workplace type of a sitcom where you've got his radio talk show that's always going on in the background of the episode, whether or not it takes a center stage. So I think that in looking at this, what you're looking at is an extremely successful spin-off from an extremely successful series that takes a character that was already reasonably well known in Cheers and develops him beyond what we're used to seeing in normal spin-offs, gives him an entirely place that he's living, keeps him, puts him in a different context. We learn a lot more about him in doing so. So I think these are shows that were not only influential, not only popular, but they tell us a lot not only about the decade of the 90s, but about everything moving forward from there.
So let me just comment or ask you some questions about the five shows, and then there's a few shows that I just want to toss in. Obviously, the biggest show would be The Simpsons, if you want to consider that a sitcom.
Yeah, I actually have that in a different
Yeah.
category,
When
but
we
you're
talk
right.
about cartoons that they came
Hmm.
from that, we'll hit that. So Seinfeld, I know the thing with Seinfeld. I think for me, how many episodes did it have? 220 episodes, something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, there were probably 20 or 30 really great episodes, and the rest of it ranged from mediocre to eh. To me, in a sense, even though it's totally different, it reminds me a lot of MASH because they were both shows that I think went well past their prime. Probably could have ended 2 or 3 years earlier. In MASH's case, maybe four. But it's like the old thing. When they were good, they were very, very good. But when it was bad, it was horrid. And I think
Mhm.
the soup Nazi and the Yankee stuff with George. Some of that stuff were particular gems. But I also found, and this was before it became well known, that Steinfeld admitted that he nicked a lot of his ideas from the old Abbott and Costello show. Uh, it seems that when the shows were bad, the characters were just utterly, totally hollow. And forget about them being nasty characters or whatnot. There just didn't seem to be a lot to be milked from them. Did you get the sense that that was a very hit and miss show as well?
Yeah, I think so, and I think you make a valid point about the expiration date on that. It it was it falls under the curse of a show that's popular enough that the network and a lot of the people involved in it want to keep it going. And from a financial standpoint, there's no particular reason to stop it. But from a creative standpoint, you're running out of ideas, you're running out of ways to portray people, and when you're dealing with a show that wasn't necessarily that deep in terms of the content, already when you're doing the same kind of shtick 2 or 3 times, it's getting even thinner and thinner. So I think that's a pretty accurate way that I look at it.
So when we talk about Friends, um, oh, it just went out of mind. Oh yeah, I always looked at Friends as sort of like a grown-up version of Scooby Doo, the cartoon show, in that you had a
Hmm.
number of friends together. They do stupid stuff, and then they would resolve it in 20 minutes. Now they weren't going after mummies and crooks and stuff like Scooby Doo, but it was this girlfriend. I want that. I want to get this raise. I want some silly little thing there. And I thought it was an okay show, but if they didn't have Jennifer Aniston, and if they didn't have the Ross and Rachel thing, which was an updating of the Sam and Diane thing from Cheers,
Yeah.
I don't know if the show would have lasted. In a sense, it was to me an even thinner premise than Seinfeld.
I think so, and I think that undoubtedly there are some very funny moments, some very charming moments, and all of these characters are not without charm, um, and appeal, and that's one of the things that makes the show popular. But again, I think that particularly when you're looking at these long-running shows, what they're really doing is kind of making a case for the British way of doing television, where you've got maybe 6 or 10 episodes of a show, and you have it, and that's your series, and you may bring it back for 6 or 7 different series, but you're not talking about much more than 50, 60 episodes altogether. And I'm the first one to say the more the merrier when it comes to my favorite shows, but I do think that there are shows that profit from less exposure. And I think that this is another example of that.
So I can't really speak too much of Home Improvement. I might have seen 2 or 3 episodes. It never really did anything for me. I guess the only
Mhm.
thing I remember is the guy who hid behind the fence.
Yes.
What did
Yeah, his name is escaping me at the moment, but
what's your take on that as a
well, it's a
show?
gimmick. It's a gimmick, but it's a very funny gimmick. You've always had unseen characters in particular sitcoms, going all the way back to the beginning. Characters that become a punchline because they could never possibly, if you ever saw them, they could never possibly live up to what they've been portrayed as being unseen. It's really a throwback to radio if you think about it, where you couldn't see characters. And so Jack Benny always was able to build up Don Wilson's weight to a point where, even if Don Wilson looked like Frank Cannon, it would be disappointing because he couldn't possibly be that big. And I think that the one thing that Home Improvement did that was smart was not pull the curtain back on something like that. But you're right. As a gimmick, it's certainly not new to sitcoms, and when it's used judiciously, it can be very funny. But I don't know if they've used it too much or not. But there's really only so much you can do with that.
Now, I know the 1970s were really the first flowering of a mini golden age for black sitcoms. You had the
Mhm.
Jeffersons, you had What's Happening, you had Good Times, and all of them had potential, I think, to be great shows themselves, but they basically became standard sitcoms. You mentioned Fresh Prince of Bel Air, though, being different. But in its day, it was going up against like 227. It was going up against the Urkel show. What is it, Family Matters? How did Fresh Prince differ from those standard fare black sitcoms of the era?
Well, and of course, it's also sharing the universe with Bill Cosby in whatever
Fr-
environment.
oh, Fresh Prince was a
Well,
crossover.
what I mean
Oh,
is that it is a Cosby universe
oh,
at
okay.
that point. So it's coming into a universe in which Cosby has already made his mark.
Uh,
And what I think is different about the Fresh Prince concept is, first of all, you've taken a rap star and turned him into a TV star. So he's a very different kind of a leading man from what you're used to seeing on TV. He's much younger than you're used to seeing. Even when you talk about a character like JJ, and you can write off some of the things that he did because of his youth, but I think that the Fresh Prince falls. Will Smith is different in some way. He's not necessarily the driver of what's going on. It's an incredible premise to put him into one of the toniest neighborhoods in California, and to have this. I don't know if you would call it a split identity, but I think it's this whole concept about having one foot in each of two different worlds. It's not the same as trying to escape the ghetto or trying to get out of the inner city. It's about being both and rather than either or. And I think that when you combine that with its propensity of bringing up issues that were particularly relevant, whether you're talking, about cultural or racial or violence or anything like that. Again, is it a show that I would put on my top five list for the decade? I don't necessarily think that I would, but it is a situation where many historians, many observers have ranked it up there, and so I think you have to consider it regardless of your own personal opinions on it, just because it did clearly make an impact in the culture. I catapulted Will Smith to Academy Award fame, and I don't know if anybody would have predicted that at the time that he was on the series.
I just noticed 3 of the 5 sitcoms you mentioned begin with the letters FR: Friends, Fresh Prince, and Frasier. I don't know what that means, but
Well, don't
so
have a focus group about it, or else
yeah,
they'll
it's
all be that one.
it seems to me, and I was not a great fan of the show. By the turn of the century, I was sort of moving beyond regular television watching. But I think Frasier of the 5 shows was probably the best show, and it probably
Mhm.
holds up the best 20 odd years later. And I would think, in terms of, future syndication, it probably will have the longest shelf life. Um, uh, the only thing I can say about it is I think it was, what the character Frasier was. I think the character that lasted the longest on television. I mean, Lucy had a longer run, Lucille Ball, than he did, but she played three distinct characters.
Yes, and I think I can bear correction on this, but I think not only does it have the longest shelf life in terms of it'll be in syndication forever, but it's not particularly dated either. In the either in terms of the way it looks with the clothes or the environment or or the things that it talks about. It has a very easy way of slipping into whatever time you're talking about. And even if you're getting into even if they're getting into things that aren't necessarily part of today's culture, they're doing so from a standpoint where you can easily understand what the point is. And there's a real talent to being timeless like that. It's something the best sitcoms have.
So I want to talk then about three shows that I would mention. One is probably mostly forgotten, but I think it was an excellent show that should have had a bigger impact. And then two other ones had big impacts and what sort of carryovers from the 80s to 90s. And I think they've had a big impact on sitcoms going forward. The one that people have forgotten was a show called Becker with Ted Danson, and it
Yes.
had the gal who played Jadzia Dax on one of the Star Trek shows. And it was, if I recall, also set in a cafe. And it seemed to me a much better show than Friends. I think Ted Danson actually had a lot more to work with as a character than he did with the Sam character from
Mhm.
Cheers, because his character was the lead of the show, but he was also sort of a cranky son of a bitch. And I think it was set in New York City. I could be wrong. And there was a cast of younger characters that he was in some way, I guess, guiding or something. I don't remember maybe I'm getting some of the premises wrong, but did you ever see that show? And what was your
I
opinion of that?
did, and I think you make a very good point about Ted Danson, not just as an actor, but I mean, not in just in terms of his talent as an actor, but of his personality, the way he comes across to viewers. When you look at an actor like Dabney Coleman, the Slap Maxwell story, it's very difficult to
Or
build a success.
Buffalo Bill too.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's very difficult to create a successful sitcom around an anti-hero or a character who is essentially unlikable. Now, I don't want to elevate Becker to that plane, but I think that you're right that Ted Danson was given a lot more to do here and a lot of room to expand his character in a way that is different from what Cheers gave him the opportunity to do. But it was also Danson's basic likability that allowed him to sell the character, that people would care about him and would be interested and would want to turn back in week after week, even even if he wasn't the most appealing, he was still somebody that a viewer could identify with and have on his side. So I think that's a very good point, and I think that it is an underrated show. There were times when I even forgot it was still on, and you would see that part. Part of that is because of the fluidity of schedules and the loss of the shared experience. Maybe things we'll get into later, but I think that it is an underrated show and a show that flies under the radar because it was never part of a must-see block or anything like that. But that's not to critique it because I think it was a very good series.
So the two shows that carried over from the 80s and I think really hit their strides in the 90s were both what I call balls to the wall comedy. They would do anything for a laugh. One of them was Night Court, and the other was
Mhm.
Married with Children, which we mentioned a little bit last month. Um, Night Court came on first. It was produced by and directed, well, produced I guess by Reinhold Weege, who had a hand in the latter years of Barney Miller. It had a somewhat similar premise. It was about the justice system, but it was about a wacky courtroom at night where anything could happen. And the characters, the first 2 or 3 years, it didn't hit its stride because two of its main leads died in back-to-back years.
That
So it
does have
wasn't,
a wife throwing a
yeah,
monkey
it
wrench
wasn't
in it.
until like 1989 through 92, the last 4 seasons, that the classic era, if you will, starring basically Marky Post as the love interest, took off. And there were just so many interesting iterations. It was in no way serious. I mean, you had a bald bailiff who was 6'8" or whatever, and you had a libidinous would-be prosecutor who betted anything with a heartbeat. But again, I think they were bad, likably bad. But since it was so over the top, for me, it was easier to like those characters than it was to like the Seinfeld characters. What is your take on Night Court generally? Because very few people ever put it up in the category of a great sitcom. To me, it and Married with Children are both flashbacks to the
Mhm.
60s where anything went.
Well, I think with both of these shows, but particularly we'll stick with Night Court. I think one of the things you allude to in that is that it's a very easy show to laugh at and to laugh with. And if what you want in a sitcom is entertainment and laughter rather than messages and special episodes, Night Court's a perfect example of that. You have, as you said, these crazy characters who are nonetheless clearly defined and well established and created. Yet they're over the top. Yet the comedy is very broad and even absurd. But you're not having them for all of that reacting in ways that are contrary to the way the characters have been structured. So they're very consistent in that sense. And yeah, Harry Anderson, again, an immensely likable man, and another sitcom that brings its roots in a way from the stand-up stage, The Magician. But I think perhaps next to Home Improvement, Night Court is the series where the lead character is the most autobiographical. That what you're really seeing a lot of Harry Anderson in that he's charming, he's funny. Marky Post is just about as winsome as any character you would ever want to have on TV. The others are characters you can laugh with or you can laugh at, and the surrealism itself is so funny in that respect. And I'm not, considering that it was rebooted on Peacock, I'm not sure why it doesn't get more respect because it certainly has carved out a niche for itself where people remember it and they talk about it. And I don't know why it isn't more highly regarded.
And Dan Larroquette basically owned the Emmy Award for sitcom male.
Absolutely.
I think what 5 in a row or something.
Well, and he did so well at creating that character that I think he established that in the future, when people talk about casting a role, they want a Dan Larroquette type of actor, or
It
it's
was
a
John
Dan
Larroquette.
Larroquette
John, it wasn't
John,
Dan.
I'm
John.
sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
type of role. And so there aren't many people who can actually turn their name and their character into an iconic type like that.
So we mentioned briefly last month Married with Children, and this is another, I think, very underrated comedy. I think it really takes apart the sitcom family far more so
Mhm.
than Roseanne Barr, which was prone to the very special episode-itis. Um, you have the characters just like Seinfeld, and in a sense, just like Night Court. They never really grow, but for some reason, maybe because it was based on the family stuff, you root for the devilishness of Al Bundy in ways I never did for Jerry Seinfeld on Seinfeld.
Mhm.
You root for Bud the shrimp every time some cheerleader slaps reality into him. You sort of root for the ever dumb Kelly and her mother whenever they suffer from bimboitis. Um, and then, of course, the neighbors. Marcy. Well, it was Marcy Jeff. No, Marcy. What was her first name? She married Steve first, or she was with Steve, and then he left after a couple of years. And you had the so-called sitcom killer. What's his name? What's the actor? The big tall guy, McGinley.
Yes,
Yeah, and
Ted. Yeah.
and I think it there was certainly misfires, but even when they misfired, you would still get that kind of pie fight kind of humor that when a show like Friends misfired or a show like Seinfeld misfired, you'd hear frogs croaking. There was just
Yeah.
something because they didn't take themselves as seriously.
Well, what's great about Married with Children, I think, in a sense, it is the anti-sitcom. And when you go back and you look at the recent history of the sitcom, and you see something like Cosby, and you see some of the other shows that are either very earnest or somewhat saccharine or very neat and clean, and I think people want a pushback against something like that, and you're ready for something different. And the 90s weren't the greatest decade in the world, especially near the beginning. And you look at what's going on, and I think that there was an edge to that show that really spoke to people, and something that they appreciated, something that again allowed them to laugh with and at the characters, but also to laugh at the world, to take apart whether it's the hypocrisy or the sanctimoniousness or the contemporary mores, but whatever it was that might be driving against you in the world, you could find some way that that show could poke it that would make you laugh and make you realize that you're part of something bigger.
Mitch, before we move on to say dramas, I do want to talk about two shows and two franchises that sort of dominated the 1990s and had a big impact on it. The first I did mention was The Simpsons, and this was sort of
Mm-hmm.
the resurrection of the primetime cartoon that you had with Rocky and Bullwinkle and the Flintstones and the Jetsons 30 years earlier. It started out as a Tracy Ullman 2 or 3 minute cartoon skit, and then took over, and then it bequeathed us Family Guy and King of the Hill and South Park and Beavis and Butthead and another dozen SpongeBob Bob or Sponge whatever he is.
SpongeBob
Yeah,
SquarePants.
yeah, yeah. So let's talk about when The Simpsons was good in the 1990s. Go ahead.
Well, the funny thing about The Simpsons is that it is probably both one of the greatest sitcoms of all time and one of the greatest animated series of all time. And the reason I didn't put it in with the other sitcoms that I had chosen was because I thought that it was almost in a category of its own. The animation allows it to approach a level of surrealism that is even greater than South Park, or not, I'm sorry, the Night Court, and even more than surrealism is just pure absurdity. And what I love about The Simpsons watching that is this totally dysfunctional family that somehow or other, just like some of the other great sitcoms we've talked about, manages to stay together, and they all love each other at the end. But there's one scene that I'll just mention was when they went to uh, a family counseling session, and they were sitting in a circle, all five of them, and they had this buzzer in front of them, and if you used the buzzer you could inflict pain on somebody else, but you would also could have pain inflicted on you. And of course the object of it was to try to get you to be more understanding and sympathetic toward the other members of the family. But by the time it had ended, they were all pressing the buzzer with abandon, trying to inflict pain on everybody else. And it was a very funny episode, but it was also such a dead-on satire of that kind of therapy in the first place that it scored on so many levels. And when you see it, all of the weird, Chief Wiggum or the mayor or any of these, the Mo, any of these other characters that are in there, Abu, they're so vivid that you forget in a way that they are not real. That in fact the same handful of people are playing all these different voices, but it's tremendously influential. And you're right. You've got Beavis and Butthead. You've got South Park. You've even got a show like Daria that I think doesn't get enough credit in terms of animation. But do do any of those exist without The Simpsons, or do, somehow or other you're able to go places in a cartoon that you can't go in real life?
Yeah.
Not just because it's animated, not just because you can create scenarios that would be prohibitively expensive to do in live action, but it's kind of like science fiction when you look at it. When Rod Serling talked about how the Twilight Zone allowed him to discuss issues he couldn't discuss otherwise, I think that the Simpsons and these other animated shows that come with it are able to go places, like Futurama. They're able to go places that you can't go in a conventional live action sitcom. So they're tremendously important and tremendously influential. But their influence mainly stays, or to a great extent, stays within the animation genre itself rather than going out into the wider live action special.
Yeah, and I think The Simpsons has now taken the crown from MASH as the TV show that overstayed its welcome the most. MASH went 11 years. The Simpsons have hit, what, 30 now?
Yeah, something like that.
34,
Some outrageous number, yeah.
I mean, it's, and I probably last watched a full episode on Fox maybe almost a decade ago, 16, 17, something like that. And it's just repeating itself. And I'm glad for the people who are making money, the people who do the voices, and okay, but it seems to me to be almost the symbol of corporate cluelessness, that you had this thing. If it had ended after 8 or 10 or even 12 seasons, you could say, I think it's a top 10 show all time. Now you can say, yeah, it had some great episodes, but and I think you mentioned Futurama. I think that had, what, 4 or 5 episodes early on, and then it's had sporadically an episode here. And to me, that's a much more consistently funny show there, as it spoofs science fiction. But
well, I'll just interject something on there that I compare to the Simpsons in a way to the Dick Van Dyke Show. The Van Dyke Show ran for 4 seasons. It's been in reruns ever since. Up until the time of cable, there probably was not a time when you couldn't find the Dick Van Dyke Show on a local station. Once cable came over, you seldom could fail to find it somewhere on the cable dial. Again, you're only talking about 4 seasons. People watch the same episodes over and over again. They love them. They can recite dialogue from them. Everybody has their favorite episodes, and many of those episodes are the favorites of everybody. You can't go back and watch 30 years of The Simpsons easily. And because it keeps generating new shows, I think that each new episode loses the impact because it's it's like that. It's like falling in love with a hot fudge sundae on a hot day. Oh, that's great, but give me 3 or 4 hot fudge sundaes in a row, I'm gonna get sick. I can't live on that. And I think it's a prime example of how scarcity can create lovability. There are very few great shows that have gone beyond a certain level, and the shows that have, a show like in the drama category, a show like Gunsmoke did so because it kept reinventing itself. And so I think that's a big problem with The Simpsons.
Yeah, and you look at the sitcoms that people know from their childhood. My wife has been rewatching Leave It to Beaver on some channel or whatnot, and Munsters, 2 years, Addams Family, 2 years, Gilligan's Island, 3 years, Batman, 3 years, The Monkees, 2 or 3 years.
Yep.
I think Get Smart maybe lasted 5 seasons, but that, the sitcoms, for whatever reasons, they remain in your mind right because of the scarcity thing.
People don't want to see 400 episodes of the same show. They want to see the same episode 400 times. Yeah. And I don't know why it is that way, but it is.
So the other 1990s dominated had to be the Star Trek franchise on television.
Hmm.
You had from 1990 to I think 2001, 12 straight seasons of, well, maybe it wasn't, yeah, 12 straight seasons of at least one Star Trek version being up there. You had the final 3 seasons of Next Generation. You had the whole of Deep Space Nine, and you had what the first 5 seasons of Star Trek Voyager. And I think generally they were good. They resurrected, and I think they generally did a good, solid job of following the original show. My favorite, actually, of the three is the least lauded one, and that's Star Trek Voyager, simply because I think those characters were the most realistic in a sense. I think they had the best cast. The Next Generation, the first couple of seasons, by the time they got to the 90s, they were running on all cylinders. I did an interview with a couple of the people who from Star Trek Deep Space Nine who played some of the Cardassians, and I think the Cardassians made Deep Space Nine. If you didn't have the Cardassian characters, that would have been just a really bad show. But Star Trek Voyager, even before they brought on the boobalicious Seven of Nine, I thought was a good solid show. And then it like Next Generation in its last 3 or 4 seasons really hit its stride. What was your take on Star Trek as a franchise in the 90s? Why did the franchise flourish in the 90s? And anything you want on those 3 shows individually?
Well, sometime, well, you remember, we can take a direct line from Seven of Nine to the Obama administration. We'll have to talk about that someday. But and the other thing to add about the franchise is that while all these different Star Trek series are coming on, at the same time, you've still got the original series running, either on a station like Sci-Fi or on local stations. So that remains a constant in the background during all of these other things. And there we go, I think, getting into why the franchise has succeeded. Number one is because it was built on a very solid foundation. You already had an audience that was predisposed to want to like anything to do with Star Trek. You had the original series, you had the movies, which were of varying quality, but invariably were successful. You introduced the new Star Treks into this same universe, operating on the same principles, occasionally with the same characters, and coming more or less from the same creative well. What I think what differentiates Star Trek from other franchises is that it paid a tremendous respect to the past, and it made it clear that the Next Generation was not a Star Trek reboot; it was a continuation. And so these all flowed with varying degrees of success into a seamless type of a storyline that takes you, and now they've gone even back further than that, and they've tried to fill in some of the gaps amongst the generation that would have been from the original series. But I think that what makes Star Trek's success interesting is that it is, perhaps, I might be wrong about this, but when I think about first run syndication, that's been so done in and undermined by the proliferation of networks and cable stations and the dominance of sitcoms within the syndication rerun cycle. You don't have very many successes with first run syndication anymore. And I wonder if Star Trek, if the Next Generation was one of the last great first run syndication series to make it. You didn't have a set time, so people, it was generally put in a time slot where people who were predisposed to liking science fiction would know where to find it and like it. It wasn't having to compete with other things in prime time necessarily. And you had the respect for the rest of the series that ensured that as long as it was done well, it would probably be a success. And of course, the other thing that I think we can't discount is that you were seeing a quasi golden age of science fiction. I think certainly when you had Star Wars and when you had that whole franchise going, and even you had Battlestar Galactica in the 80s, which I wouldn't count as a success in the original incarnation. But what it indicated was there was a desire for serious adult science fiction, not science fiction that was kid oriented, not science fiction that was outrageous or almost a lampoon of science fiction, but what the original concept of Star Trek, the idea of a serious adult drama oriented science fiction series with a recurring cast of characters in a universe that would continue, that would be a part of the stories, the Federation, the different opponents, they were all part of that same broader, when we talk about television universes, and each one, as they went in, tried to present that universe from a slightly different perspective, whether you had a space station or you had a female captain or you had a different kind of mission. They were all trying to take it in different ways, and they went places and brought up issues that could be very controversial in the 90s. I remember there was a lot of pushback against some of the episodes when they first came on, especially on The Next Generation, but going forward as well. So when science fiction is generating controversy, that's usually seen as a good thing because people regard the series seriously as a thinking person's show, as something that is a show that includes ideas. And you can't disagree with ideas until ideas are presented. And I think that plus those magic words, Star Trek, suggested that you would have to do a really bad job with the series and be very disrespectful toward the franchise as a whole to fail. You might not be as successful, but to fail would have taken quite a bit of doing.
So, other than Next Generation, let me just ask you briefly about Deep Space Nine and then Voyager. To me, Deep Space Nine's role in Star Trek mythos. I mean, it's become to look at, and a lot of people now say that it was the best of the Star Trek shows. I strongly disagree, but I think the one thing it did add to the mythos is I believe that's where the what is it called 31 there's an organization within it that's sort of like the CIA. What is it? 31st Amendment or something. But that is where we see that the Federation of Planets is actually a kind of dystopia. That it's a surveillance state. That this shadow group that answers to no one. They then there's the Dominion War, and Cisco is complicit in an outright assassination of one of, I think it's a Romulan stuff. So I think those are great elements it added. Overall, I don't think the show succeeds well, but I think it made a more realistic future than the Roddenberry vision.
I would agree because Roddenberry really created kind of a panacea, and any introduction of an idea like the Prime Directive is already talking about a sort of utopia that is
Section
not
31.
necessarily
Section 31
feasible.
is the name of the group. Section
Okay.
31.
One of the things that I have found in doing the research I did beyond for my Darkness in Prime Time book, where you're talking about dystopic futures, is that a dystopia often is founded on the basis of a utopia, and that you're trying to create a better world, but in order to create a better world, you got to have somebody out there defining what better means. And then you've got to have the ability to enforce the better world. And you've got to be able to have someone in control who can't get bound down in red tape or in different kinds of bureaucratic snafus. And so you can see both a dysfunction and a need for a strong man in something like that. And I think when you talk about Deep Space Nine, what it did do very well was a brilliant job of kind of previewing the all of the things that you get when you talk about conspiracy theories and the deep state and the secret organizations that don't answer to anybody. And what it does brilliantly as a science fiction series is to discuss these things out in the open without having the baggage that would have been attached to it if it was trying to be a contemporary series, which again is why you see so few contemporary series that actually succeed at those kinds of issues.
And the thing with Voyager that I think gets it slagged on as the least of that run of shows, although to be fair, Enterprise, which came after it, was probably even more slagged upon, and rightly so, is I think people say, oh, well, they neutered the Borg, and the Borg were the greatest villains. To me, the Borg were a shit villains. I mean, they were such obvious stand-ins for communism that, and what Voyager actually did was present possibly better villains that have never been followed up on. There was the Species 8472, I think, something like that, which were these. They came from liquid space or fluid space and whatnot. And this is an interesting idea. Whether it's plausible, who knows? But they were a much more interesting thing, and they could shapeshift and make themselves look human. And then they also introduced, to me, what if I was going to do a Star Trek movie, they introduced the species of dinosaurs who left Earth 65 million years ago before the asteroid hit, evolved and became a super species. And they have one great episode about them, and then they dropped them. But they took those chances, and to me, they made far more interesting villains than the Borg ever did. So I'm glad that the Borg was sort of shuttled off into the wastebasket. I mean, although they made a movie a few years later with the original or the Next Generation crew. What was your take on that series?
I would agree with that. I think that it's very easy to set up a species like the Borg as kind of a pantomime villain, and you can get some mileage out of it, but when you keep having a recurring villain, you fall into the trap of you knowing that they're going to be defeated and wondering why they can't be put away. They almost become like a Terminator. But I think that series had a challenge in that it was what the third of the revival shows, and so it's already got two shows that have met with varying degrees of success that it has to live up to. It's got a very solid cast though, and it does precisely what the mission of the first series was, which was go where nobody had gone before. Right. And it does that. And it carves out its own niche as to how it differentiates itself from the other series. And it does it very well. And I wish it did get more credit than it did, because it had an excellent cast and it had provocative storylines, and it just I don't know, maybe there was just too much on at that time to appreciate it as its own.
Two episodes stand out in my mind as being really good. One was with the Voyager crew encounters another spaceship that was flung 70,000 miles away. And they end up killing some aliens to use them for fuel. So this brings up an ethical crisis of whether you can do that, animal humane treatment kind of things. And then the other one was an episode called Year of Hell, which was a two-part episode where the guy from that 70s show, the father, plays a guy who keeps switching time because he wants to get his empire or his species empire back to what it was, because his wife died in one timeline and he keeps switching it. And the thing is, at the end, Voyager, somehow by crashing their ship into it, they set everything back to normal. And a lot of people said, well, this was a bad show. But that's the very point of the episode, is that a lot of these things are futile. The violence is futile. Empire building is futile. And whether or not you could do with the characters, or whether or not it's plausible scientifically, is beside the point. Because it's a television show. It's not supposed to be just something that came from Albert Einstein's mind pure.
Yeah, and it's dealing in allegory. It's dealing in what if. It is tackling some very unpleasant truths in an episode like that. And yeah, there are people who are not going to appreciate it, who want things to be less complicated, more straightforward. But that's a terrific example of what science fiction can do at its very best. It's not about the special effects or the science part of it. It's about the fiction part of it and the drama that it entails, the drama of the human condition. You can even use that phrase when you're talking about aliens, but the human condition, the human comedy, all the things that we are prone to is what science fiction at its very best deals with.
So you can't talk about Star Trek in the 90s without bringing up Babylon 5, because that's sort of the counterweight, and sort of the counterweight especially to Deep Space Nine. And I think we've mentioned this once before on the show. I forget in which context. But what was your take on that versus Deep Space Nine especially?
Well, Babylon 5 had a long run, a long and successful run. And I think that that in itself is a positive. But I've always considered Babylon 5, and maybe wrongly so, to fall more into the category of like a space soap opera. That it really emphasizes what happens with the individual characters. You've got a star, first of all, Bruce Boxleitner, who is, when he takes over and becomes the star of the series, um, it's a bit unlike any of the other series in that you've got someone who's already established as having had a very successful career in television, very marketable, very recognizable, and he slips very comfortably into that star quality that you don't necessarily have when you have actors who are less known who become the characters that they're playing, and they don't have you know, the John Wayne kind of character. But I remember when it first came on, and they talked about it, and it was kind of like a novel for television. I think they may have even used that phrase, and so it was interested in telling a long story, and I think that's really what distinguishes it, is that yes, it has arcs, it has subplots, it has stories that can be self-contained in and of themselves, but it's all part of a continuing story. And I was never a huge fan of it. I don't say that to put it down. It was at a point in time where I was kind of transitioning out of watching a lot of science fiction, but I think that the fact that it was on for 5 seasons and that it was successful, they did the big screen movies, they had it really run by one man, and I think that it, I think it compares favorably to the other Star Treks, but it's different.
Mitch, the 1990s were an interesting decade regarding dramatic television, because we basically saw cop shows and medical shows still remaining, but the big drama shows of the 80s, which were primetime soap operas, basically dried up, with the exception of Fox with Beverly Hills 90210, and then its spin-off series Melrose Place, which were aimed at younger audiences than Dynasty or Dallas was. Why did soap operas other than Fox die on
Well, I
prime time?
think the conventional explanation for that, which I have no reason to really argue with, I guess, is that the 80s were a decade of conspicuous consumption. And you had, in part, that greed is good mentality that was present. And you had, during the Reagan years, you had great periods within that of prosperity. You had a general culture that was geared toward deregulation. You had the glamour quotient was back that we didn't see in the 70s, and or that if we did see it, it was kind of trashy. And the 80s had its own trash elegance to it. I don't, I say this lovingly about Joan Collins, but you can easily work trashy into a description of Alexis Carrington, and it fits perfectly. But I think that by the 90s, you're seeing kind of, if not a revulsion, you're at least seeing kind of a backing away from that kind of lavish lifestyle of the rich and famous type of soap opera. And when you look at something like Beverly Hills 90210, you're torn about whether or not to describe it as a soap opera or as a teen show. And it winds up being a little bit of both. It's soap opera for teens type of thing that adults can watch too. But what they're doing is focusing on a different demographic again. Part of that is going to be driven by the needs of the networks. And one thing we haven't touched on much through this is that at this point in the 90s, we not only have Fox, which has established itself as the legitimate fourth network, but you've also got the WB, you've got you've got the CW, you've got these micro networks that are looking to position themselves demographically rather than trying for broad audiences. So, and you also have Fox buying into that demographic as well. So all of a sudden, it's much easier, much more profitable to have a teen soap opera than it is to have a Dallas type of soap opera. And in the same way, if you want to expand this idea of science fiction, it's much easier to have a sci-fi horror series like Buffy than it is to do something that is much more heavily special effects like the other science fiction shows we've been talking about. So you've got a market-driven niche that's been created for teen and young adult shows, and you are simply adapting the genres that have worked in the past into that niche market. So instead of Dallas, you've got a 90210. I think that's probably the easiest explanation for it, because if you look at the stars of those shows, they are for the most part young, beautiful, handsome stars, just like the soap operas. You've got lots of sex and drugs and inter-family tensions, just like the other soap operas. They're dealing with certain specific issues that are important to young generations, but they have their parallels in the older generations. So I think that's really just changing climate, changing time, changing economy. But what doesn't really change is what the show is about. The other thing that does change, of course, is the quality, and that's where you can argue about whether these shows live up to their predecessors. But they're certainly cut out of the same bolt of cloth. If the cloth may not be the same color.
It seems to me, and again, I was sort of getting off of watching primetime television in this
Mm-hmm.
era. It seems to me that dramas other than primetime soaps just were based. There wasn't really any innovation going on then. You'd had some innovation in the '80s with the Hill Street Blues and NYPD Blue, and but it seems ER seems to be almost the prototypical hospital show.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there weren't any shows that were like the Rockford Files or Magnum PI that had charismatic characters that were snarky or whatnot. What was the defining quality of drama in the 1990s?
I think it's hard. I think adult is probably the defining quality, because what you're seeing is the beginning of what we would come to call prestige television, even though it isn't prestigious, particularly in comparison. But you'll see a series on HBO like Oz, and you're dealing with a frankness and a meanness about it that is different from what you have seen in other TV shows, and it's coming to you on a premium cable station, which is different from what you're used to seeing. It's going to be much more explicit, not only in its language but in the storylines they're doing themselves. A show that might never be seen on a network in the 90s. So I think that's one aspect of what the drama theme is this idea that you're going to be very much more open about it. NYPD Blue, which extends into the 90s, but I think you could say that is roughly an equivalent on network television, where even very briefly you have particularly female nudity, some male nudity, but the concept of nudity at all on network television in prime time is an extraordinary idea on American television. Now, of course, in British television, it had been around for quite a while, and even on public television, you had it. But you're talking about competing with the theaters, competing with all the other kinds of entertainment options that are out there, and this argument that someone like Stephen Bochco would make that television has got to come up with something different, something more frank, something more honest. And so I think that is another quality that you see is this idea of not only the adult-oriented show, but this theme of going into different places than what you were used to. I think the third distinguishing characteristic of the decade is quirkiness, and I think that the example for all time of that is going to be Twin Peaks, which has a unique situation. I think you could make valid arguments both that Twin Peaks had the potential to be the greatest series ever seen on television, and that it had the potential to be one of the worst series ever seen on television. And you can get both of those in the same series. The first season of Twin Peaks was terrific. The second season of Twin Peaks was terrible. You can pretty much dictate how well the series goes by what David Lynch's involvement with it is. But I would go back and argue that the first episode of Twin Peaks, the whatever you want to call it, the pilot, the premiere, I think it was 2 hours. But I would argue that, for me at least, that was the greatest single episode ever seen on television of any series. It had all of these so unlike television moments that were cinematic, they were sinister, they were surrealistic. This I can talk about a bit in detail, just because this is an episode I loved of a show that I liked quite a bit, despite all of its flaws. But you've got one scene where you simply have a shot of a ceiling fan rotating. You've got the shot of the stoplight swinging back and forth in the wind. You have this, I think, most memorable scene of the entire episode, of the entire series, when when the kids in the school, and by the way, they're terrible representations of teenagers. None of these kids in that high school are teenagers. But when you have the moment where they're all noticing that Laura's not there, and they're wondering what has happened, and there's some rumors going by, and then you have this shot through the window of the classroom of this girl running across the lawn crying, and all of a sudden they know what that meant. And I think we'd seen the body already, but that subtlety of that scene is something that nobody was accustomed to seeing on television, and it completely changed the way people would look at television. From then on, television became, I think, a more cinematic experience in terms of those kinds of shots. Previously, you had seen that kind of thing in a series like The Outer Limits, which leaned both into noir and into classic sci-fi, but you didn't see it in your typical series. And it created quirkiness, and quirkiness wound up being both a cliche and something you could laugh at. But it reminds me of something that Judith Crist, the film critic, said about the movie Shane once. That Shane did not give you the Western cliche; it created them. All of those cliches that came in other Westerns were created in Shane. They were the originals. And it's the same thing, I think, with Twin Peaks. It has been often duplicated, never equaled. You had a show like Erie, Indiana, which I can talk about because I live in Indiana, but you have Northern Exposure, you have all of these other series that try to capitalize on quirkiness. They try in some way even to be a serious version of My Favorite Martian, but none of them live up to Twin Peaks, but they all see what Twin Peaks did and try to emulate it in some way. So those are my nominations for what stand out in drama: adult topics and presentations, serious dramas that introduce the prestige, and cinematic dramas that foresee kind of a melding of television and movies, and the idea of bringing film directors into working on television as we had never seen it before. Imagine Bergman doing a weekly series. You can't, and yet that's kind of what it was like when Lynch gets involved in a weekly series.
Well, he did do miniseries, Bergman, what, the
Yes, he
one about
did.
the marriage. But
Yeah.
when I think of 90s dramas, I think of David Kelly. I think of Picket Fences and
Mhm.
Ally McBeal. And both of those shows had two or three really terrific seasons, and then they became overly quirky and clunky. And later,
Mhm.
Boston Legal with William Shatner
Thing, yeah.
playing William Shatner, basically,
Mhm.
or at least the version of the celebrity William Shatner version. What he's like in real life, who knows? But
You
so,
notice we're getting a theme here that we've been talking about throughout these different genres are shows that outlive their usefulness.
mm,
I don't say they outlive their welcome because they still stay popular after they've outlived their usefulness, but they're no longer useful at introducing new original storylines or concepts or characters. They just keep repeating the same theme like a record player where the record has a scratch in it and it keeps going back to the beginning. So they outlive their usefulness as a show.
well, picking up on that theme, it seems to me that the area of television in the 1990s that suffered the most was morning and afternoon programming. Soap operas had hit a high in the 1980s with General Hospital, Luke and Laura dominating that decade. And then we switched over to Young and Restless, which has now been like a 35-year run as the top soap opera. But from 1990 to 2000, you went from something like 14 or 15 soap operas on television down to 7 or 8, and now it's down to just 3 network ones. Although a new one has emerged, I guess, on CBS, so maybe we're back up to
Mhm.
4. Uh, Game shows went from the 1980s having such a variety on network television that uh, really only you have now Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune at night during the afternoons or early morning. The only one that's on now is what's his name, the one with Drew Carey on Price is Right.
Yeah, The Price is Right.
And so that probably suffered even a more dramatic decline than
Hmm.
soap operas. And then the thing that did seem to prosper, which I wish didn't prosper, was the chat show. Whether it's The View, and then later on The Talk, and then of course carrying over from the Oprah Winfrey Prime and the Geraldos and the DNA test is Who's Your Daddy stuff on assorted shows.
Yeah.
Um, so talk about non-primetime television at this era.
Well, it is a disaster, I think, and I think you've hit it precisely on what we lost. Um, Soap operas are, with some justification, a source of ridicule, stories. But one of the things that I think people do tend to forget about with soap operas is that there was a certain degree of literacy to them. You know, James Lipton wrote a lot for soap operas before he got into Inside the Actor's Studio. And I remember him writing an article in TV Guide back in the day about his experiences writing for the soaps and what he felt their strengths were, and that the soaps were far more progressive at tackling the issues of the day than primetime shows were. And even a social critic like Maria Manis, who you would think might scoff at soap operas, had some kind things to say about them, and ways that they could be improved. So soaps had a purpose, and I suppose that the advent of the primetime soap, and then the willingness of primetime television in general to go to more controversial areas than the soap operas had, maybe foresaw what was going to happen. But you're right. I'm going to blame, at least in part, the OJ trial for the proliferation of some of these shows, because all of a sudden the people who were the most sought after on television were the people that we used to think of as just the talking heads. Everybody became an expert on something, and they started a cottage industry of being able to talk about these things. People you'd never heard of before all of a sudden become experts. And so this is opening the door to the idea of talking about these things. You get of course, the success of talk shows in general. Once you had Donahue and then you had Oprah, you were guaranteed that there were going to be talk shows in the daytime that are so different from the talk shows you would see at night in the Carson era that they hardly deserve to be mentioned as talk shows in the same genre. But you know, you had these shows, and you already had an audience that was becoming predisposed to simply listening to people talk during the day. So I imagine there was an intersection between the celebrity nature of the experts on the OJ trial and all of the celebrities who suddenly became talk show hosts. Everybody from, you know, Ellen, Vicky, Carrie, all these, you had all of these amorphous celebrities becoming talk show hosts, and they were talking about all of these trash topics. Jerry Springer is probably the best example of that, and you can see Springer trying to create a niche for himself. It was pretty easy to see he wasn't going to be able to take on somebody like Oprah in just talking about with celebrities. So he had to go the other way, and that was to make everybody a celebrity by equating celebritydom with being notorious. Now, again, if you don't have the Simpson trial, you don't have the Kardashians, and we probably should hold O.J. Simpson responsible for that, if nothing else. But without Simpson, you don't have the Kardashians. You don't have that kind of reality television, and you don't have the fuel and the fodder that leads to these kinds of celebrity-dominated talk shows. You know, I realize I'm kind of going around and around with this topic, but I think what it all boils down to is that the Simpson trial was a voyeur's delight, a voyeur's wet dream to see something like that. One of the most famous athletes in American history on trial for murdering his ex-wife, and everybody was interested in it. Everybody talked about it. Everybody became a celebrity. The next evolution of that is that the celebrities themselves become the topics of these talk shows. The celebrities become the hosts of these talk shows, and then you start to redefine what the meaning of celebrity is. And so you have somebody like Maury Povich, who used to be a fairly serious journalist before he got into the talk show wars. And you have all of these byproducts of it, and they're popular enough, and they have enough material. You know, Sally Jesse Raphael was a fairly successful radio host before she moved into
Connie
TV.
Chung.
Yeah, exactly. They all had levels of credibility before they got into the TV thing. But in the 90s, the appetite for this kind of celebrity orientated stuff was insatiable. And so that it overran daytime television like a weed. And I think that's what lights they were fairly inexpensive to put on. They attracted the right demographic of audience. You kids would watch them during their breaks in school. Women would watch them if they were working from the home. They had a ready built audience. They had ready built uh, figures to be brought on there. We're living in a sordid world. Why not? You know, it's a true life soap opera.
And that gets to, I was going to talk about the news outlets, and it seems to me that all of this pseudo news
Mhm.
or para news, if you want to use a more scientific term, these shows try to present themselves as somewhat being journalistic, but they really weren't. And then you
No.
look at the 90s, you had the big trio of Rather, Jennings, and Brokaw on the network newses. And
Mhm.
as long as they were there, you had a sort of still seemingly independent fourth estate, or was it the third estate or the fourth estate? Why do I forget what it is? But once they went down one by one, I think Jennings died, Rather was fired, Brokaw retired in
Retired,
the
yeah.
early 2000s. Once that went down, network news really went to shit
It did.
because it was ratings. Rather, it became 100% quote unquote business, and you had to
Hmm.
have these stupid stories. You couldn't talk about this, and we've seen now 20 years later, 60 Minutes is fired a couple of people because they want to lower their journalistic standards. And so it seems this was 30 years ago, and you could probably go back to the Simpson thing as being the egg that opened up, the Pandora's box that opened
It
up,
did, yeah.
and it's totally consumed it to the point now that most people I've read trust online political commentators, left or right, more than they do the networks or CNN or MSNBC
Hmm.
or Fox or whatever, and likely so. And it just seems that this was the moment, the mid 1990s, and yeah, I guess I would have to agree. O.J. Simpson was the bugaboo that consumed.
Well, and consumption is the right way to look at it because the Simpson trial was virtually 24/7 on every news channel and every other station that didn't have something else on. And when the Simpson trial ends, you got to fill that time up with something. And what they discovered was that there was not a 24/7 news market out there unless you created it. What there was a market for was something like maybe a 1 hour version of headline news with some special news pockets that would that you could do. You could do like a Wall Street show. You could do a foreign affairs show. You could do some roundtable shows. But the gist of it would be that you would be able to expand the news from a half an hour to an hour and do fairly hard news. That's the ideal of what a 24/7 news station should be like. What we wound up with was more of the same, more of the celebrity stuff, more of the trivial stuff. I mean, anytime anybody, I think we've talked about this before, anytime there's anything that happens anywhere in the country, all of a sudden it becomes an issue of national importance. Everything is breaking news. Every car chase, every murder, every accident, um, is a massacre. It is a catastrophe. It's a tragedy. And what it actually is life. And it's not consequential to most people in the world. But once you drive this celebrity market and once you have this sensationalism, this is what you're going to get stuck with. People forget that when you talk about the big three, in the news. Two of the big three. Well, of course, Rather had been well known on news on television since '63 when he was in Dallas for the assassination. So Rather visibly worked his way up the ladder until he came to the anchor chair. Whether you like him or not, you can't disagree with the fact that he worked his way up to the top. Jennings, before he was a foreign correspondent and had done such a good job, it's very easy for people to forget that he became the anchor of the ABC Evening News when he was 27 years old. And his contemporaries at that point were not Brokaw and Rather. He was going up against Huntley and Brinkley on NBC and Cronkite on CBS. His network news show was only 15 minutes long. That's how far back Jennings went. And Brokaw, before he was the network news host, he'd been on the Today Show. Before he'd been on the Today Show, he'd been a figure on the local news in Los Angeles, and he'd done things for NBC. All of them had a gravitas and a credibility that stemmed from the generation in which they came of prominence. And you can't say the same about the anchors today, many of whom are completely unfamiliar to the diminishing audience that watches network news in the first place, most of whom seem more interested in connecting with you on a human level and telling the stories that really matter than simply sitting there and reporting the news. Very few of them seem to have the ability to be able to go out and cover a news story and actually have earned their stripes as a reporter like Walter Cronkite did or Edward R. Murrow. So it's no wonder when you throw all of that into the mix, this is the horrible goulash that you wind up with.
I think that anyone who's watched these shows that we've done could probably discern that both of us would probably be considered on the left or progressive side of the political spectrum. And I'm someone who is no fan of Donald Trump. I wasn't a fan of Joe Biden or the Democrats. I'm a third party person myself. But I literally saw, just to show how far the discourse has fallen. Whatever you want to say about Rather, Jennings, Brokaw, and that era, it was far better than what we have now, because I saw a left-wing 22, 24-year-old kid who's anti-Trump and ostensibly would probably agree with 90% of what I say. He did a 20-minute post about, this was about 2 or 3 weeks I saw it ago, Trump farts in public. This is what it, now, literally, and he's dissecting down, and he's getting down to, did you hear that? Did you? Now, in what? But this is because the YouTube algorithm feeds this, and so he wants to make I don't know, maybe he got 500,000 views on this, and maybe I don't know what he gets, maybe he gets a couple of $100 for that. Whatever you said, the worst with Dan Rather, the worst with Jennings and Brokaw is it's a different human expression than this. This is not news.
No,
Whatever you say about Trump, I don't care if he's gaseous.
Well, and I think what we're coming in this segment, what we're really looking at, if we can find some kind of a theme to all of these disparate elements, is this idea of celebrity, or if not celebrity, at least a focus on the individual. Now, Huntley and Brinkley, Cronkite, Brokaw, Rather, Jennings, they all had egos, or they wouldn't have gotten to where they were in the first place. But you never got the impression watching the news. Well, maybe a little bit with Rather, but I think that's a personality quirk more than anything else. You never got the impression that they were on there to have you listen to them talk. That they were in love with the sound of their own voices. They were there to present a story. Jennings, in particular, was a serious journalist who'd earned all of his stripes out there in the middle of wars and disasters, covering things on the ground. They were there to project seriousness and gravitas and to steer the news from one story to another. And occasionally they would go out in the field and report on something, particularly Jennings, but it wasn't all about them. And I think that as we get further into the 90s, You see this changing in the daytime talk shows. You see it changing in the news. You see it changing in the definition of celebrity. You see it in the reality shows where the next best thing is to offer everyone a chance to be a celebrity for at least 15 minutes. And if you're smart, you can parlay that into even more times. So I think that is an overriding theme of what we're seeing in this aspect of the program is the emergence of the ego and the id and the dominance of celebrity culture and the desire of people to become celebrities. If the 80s were about greed and glamour and the nighttime soap, the 90s are almost an egalitarian version of that, that everybody has a chance to do something like that. Everybody can be a star.
So let's end the show on a lighter and brighter note, though, with two things.
Yeah.
Uh, the 1990s, I don't think you can talk about them in television without talking about these two aspects. One, on the lighter side, is the golden age, I guess, of professional wrestling. You'd had golden ages back in the 50s, 40s, and 50s with a guy named George, what's his name?
Gorgeous George.
Gorgeous George. And then you had the 80s with Hulk Hogan and all that, and then the steroids thing came along. But then a few years later, you had basically two wrestling leagues, the World Championship Wrestling and the WWE or WWF still at the time, World Wrestling Federation. And this basically WWE won, and it created a handful of big name stars that were known. You'd know the names outside of wrestling, even if you didn't hear it. Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Dwayne Williams, now probably the biggest action stars since Schwarzenegger and Stallone in their primes in the 80s. And then some lesser guys who made like a John Cena, but that have still done a few roles. Dave Bautista has been in a number of science fiction films. And so that was light. That was what the kids were doing. But on the real bright side, you also had PBS at its finest. You had American Masters, the American Experience. You had the films of Ken Burns. And even though some people have criticized his methods, he was still able to educate mostly with that. So do you have any comments on both ends of that, the lighter stuff with Rise of Pro Wrestling and PBS in its golden age?
Well, I think pro wrestling was great theater, and it was a throwback. People might find this comparison strange, but in a way I liken pro wrestling to westerns because it had the good guy and the bad guy, and every match was a morality play in miniature, and it was in some cases your country when they would introduce a character like the Iron Sheik. In other cases, it was your value system, but it became a good and bad, right and wrong theater every match, every week, and it crossed over to where it was on NBC one Saturday night a month in place of Saturday Night Live, and you had these very broad, very colorful characters, and you didn't have the pretensions towards serious stuff, real stuff by that. I mean, that you have now. When you get pro wrestling on ESPN, not as a Saturday morning show, but when you see them spending the money that they've spent to tie in with WWE and present WrestleMania on ESPN networks, it takes itself too seriously now. But in the 90s, it didn't. In the 90s, Vince McMahon, I didn't talk about a pantomime villain. Gorilla Monsoon, all these larger than life characters. And it was really a lot of fun to watch back then. And it was entertainment. It was and entertaining. I think that was great, and I think you're right too about PBS. When you look at baseball, when you look at the Civil War, when you look at the Burns output, but beyond that, I occasionally will go back on the Internet Archive and catch some of the old episodes of The American Experience, where I get to see things that I wouldn't see today. I wouldn't see an hour-long documentary on the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire.
Yeah.
I wouldn't see an hour on the DNA evidence about the Dr. Sam Shepard case. There are a lot of things that they did back then before they really, and pardon me for phrasing it this way, before they began to pander to the audience to try to raise more money to fund the shows that they were funding, and they wound up really being an outlet for a lot of oldies rock concerts and the like. When they would do some of these challenging things like Nova and well, even Cosmos, when you go back that far, you still saw that in the 90s. You still saw some really decent programming on PBS. You saw some bad stuff too, but you saw shows that were serious and that were meant for adults. And I think one of the greatest documentaries that they showed on PBS, it's in the 2000s. It was the documentary series on New York, but it was in preparation in the 90s. And to do a long form documentary like that, and it has its faults just like everything else, but it was a stunning piece of television. And on occasion, PBS is still capable of doing that. It's capable of being more than just an outlet for British television. But it doesn't fulfill that role that often anymore, and it's too bad. And talk about the lighter side for just a second, because I know there are people out there, Hadley, you don't like anything. You're a curmudgeon. And it's true. When I'm done, I'm gonna disconnect everything and go out and yell at kids to get off the lawn and then shout at the clouds for a little while. But I do like newer things, and one of my all-time favorite shows is from the 90s, and that's Mystery Science Theater 3000. It is one of the smartest, sharpest, most satirical shows on the air, and it's hip, it is culturally significant, it is smart, because not only are the jokes intelligent, but you really got to know things to get a lot of them. But it's also one of the funniest shows on TV, and that's my go-to show anytime I need to watch something where I need a lift or just have to have the TV on. So if the 90s brought nothing more than Mystery Science Theater, then it was a great decade. And I count myself as one of the fortunate ones that I don't know if you did, but I lived in the Twin Cities when MST premiered. And I saw the very first 2 episodes of it on Thanksgiving night on KTMA. And there were a couple of Thunderbirds puppets movies. And you looked at it and you either thought, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life, or this is the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. And the fact that it still holds up all these years later shows what quality television is really all about. And it's still there even in the 90s. There are some great examples of it.
I will mention before we end, Rick Burns, the brother of Ken Burns, also did a number of good documentaries for PBS.
Yeah, he did New York, as a matter of fact.
And the West.
Yes.
But the one that really sticks out to me as just filmically, cinematically, as a great film, even though it was on PBS, Into the Deep, which was about the sinking of the Essex, the real-life Moby Dick. It is a magnificent work of art, and I think it's the best thing either of the Burns brothers did. But Rick has never gotten to do that his older brother has gotten. But I wanted to throw that out there. So it looks like the next time we tackle this subject, decades-wise, we'll be heading into the 21st century. But who knows? Maybe a few months we'll have some things in between. But Mitch, always good to speak to you, and we'll be back next week with more.
Okay, great.